Hey everyone, I'm Brett Scott. I'm the author of Cloud Money and the Heretic's Guide to Global Finance. And in this 7-part series, I'm going to take you from the ground level of our economy all the way through up to the highest levels of global corporate capitalism. This has been made in collaboration with Lankelly Chase. This is part 3 of 7. So, let's begin. So here's a dilemma. Many people cannot clearly describe what capitalism is, or for that matter, how a modern capitalist economy works. But they also actually cannot imagine anything else existing. Much like a fish cannot get enough distance from water to see it clearly, we often can't get enough distance from our system to observe it properly. Now, this is actually why it often helps to turn to economic anthropology, which is often specialized in looking at parallel ways of being. Basically, societies that operate with non-capitalist principles, or what you might call pre-capitalist principles. Often you'll find societies that have combinations of market economies plus tribal economies and other forms of economies simultaneously. Historically, these different types of economies will often emphasize or draw upon different parts of ourselves. They'll foreground different moral logics and they'll foreground different parts of our human nature, as it were. Now, there's lots of really good resources available on economic anthropology, but if you want to check out a good introductory video on YouTube, I recommend checking out this one from the Professor Alan McFarlane from Cambridge University. In this video, he goes through hunter-gatherer economies, tribal economies, feudal economies, and eventually market economies. But let me quickly summarize his points about the first 2 styles of economy, because it then really helps us to understand the subsequent feudal and capitalist systems. Hunter-gatherer societies. So, hunter-gathering is the oldest form of economic life, and it stretches back a good 200,000 years. Hunter-gatherers basically forage and hunt from their surroundings, working about 1 to 3 hours per day. They're generally nomadic, living in light shelters, and often in these small, fluid bands. Within hunter-gatherer society, people often have the ability to leave one band for another, which means it's actually pretty hard for any chief to establish themselves or to dominate over people. Now, a distinction can be made between groups like the Hadza in Tanzania, who will immediately eat things that they hunt and gather, and other groups like the Inuit, who have storage systems that enable a certain amount of accumulation and therefore stratification or social stratification to take place. Horticultural and pastoral tribes. So, tribal society is thought to emerge around 20,000 to 10,000 years ago. And basically it's associated with people beginning to actively produce their own food via the domestication of crops and animals. Now, there are a lot more tribes than hunter-gatherers in the contemporary world, and they have more complex social structures. But unlike capitalist systems, where we're often encouraged to imagine that the economic realm is something separate from everything else, tribal society will often integrate those. It imagines that economic life cannot be separated and it's not distinct from religious rituals, culture, politics, etc. Tribal people will often work more than hunter-gatherers, but their labor often has seasonal shifts and is still relatively light. Now, horticultural tribes are found in the forests of Amazonia, Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, while pastoral tribes that herd cattle, sheep, and goats are found throughout North Africa, Middle East, and also into Central Asia and Siberia. The state and the drive to civilize tribes into peasants. Now, before the arrival of states, we might imagine a whole range of societies with variations in structure. So let's picture this in stylized terms by using these different images here. Imagine these images as simplified representations of these different structures. Now, tribal groups were often semi-nomadic, but around 6,000 years ago, we see the emergence of what's called states, which are basically these settled political units, social structures that stay in one place, such as river valleys. These societies started to have high accumulation of goods, and with that came power concentrated into these kings that controlled standing armies alongside bureaucracies with written languages as well. So when old historians are talking about the first quote-unquote civilizations, they're often referring to these systems. Now, states historically have much, much higher stratification than tribes. They got these aristocracies that begin to see themselves as naturally superior to peasants. Or in places like West Africa and India, higher caste people who saw themselves as being closer to God somehow and therefore deserving of power. Now, these elites would often see semi-nomadic tribes as being uncivilized barbarians. Basically, these tribes on the outskirts of state society hadn't been sucked in and incorporated. So through the eyes of the elites, they needed to be subjugated and turned into, well, literally subjects. So the classic state mentality is to absorb and incorporate people like that under a single system. Furthermore, the rise of money is closely linked to this complex of states who are demanding tribute and getting people indebted in various ways. This is why peasant societies are often closely linked with the rise of debt bondage and slavery. So mainstream economists will often tell a kind of just so story about money, a kind of folk tale in a way, in which they imagine money to be this kind of useful invention that spontaneously emerged to help people trade. They'll often tell these stories where they imagine everyone who's sort of stumbling around trying to barter goods and services, and then they find that really inconvenient, so they kind of just invent money to help them do this trading. Now, from an anthropological perspective, this story is completely inaccurate, because within anthropology, the tradition has actually been to look at how the rise of modern money is intrinsically linked to the rise of state expansion and imperialism. Essentially, money is a political system rather than some kind of spontaneous economic invention. Now, that's too big of a story for us to tell here, but the short version is something like this. Political rulers introduced credit systems, forms of coinage, and tribute systems that gradually snowballed into larger systems. Now, tribal people that resisted so-called civilization would often be pushed into the hills or forests or deserts, basically places that were hard to absorb or hard to bring under control. And actually, to this day, you can still find tribal people in those types of areas. So for example, in Myanmar, you find the Karen Hill tribes who still fight for independence from the state to this day. In fact, the derogatory term used by the dominant Myanmar state for these people is the wild cattle of the hills. So this process of incorporation under states is the basis of what becomes called feudalism. Now, unlike tribal people who basically work for themselves, peasants would live in the countryside but were subordinated to this distant class of elites, literati, and priests who they had to basically just give tribute to in the form of either goods or money. Peasants were required to produce an agricultural surplus, which means they had to work really, really hard, i.e. something like 8 to 15 hours per day, which is a lot more than the hunter-gatherer or tribal societies. Now, feudalism was the dominant form that stratified state societies took until the 1500s, but feudal society was relatively rigid and non-marketized. Markets were actually on the periphery of feudal society rather than being in the center. Now, what we call the transition to capitalism often refers to this process by which the market monetary exchange moves from the periphery of the society to the center of the society to become the central defining logic of economic life. There was this shift in power from agricultural nobles, who were at the center of the feudal system, towards the urban merchants, who were at the center of the capitalist monetary system. Now, in this context, peasants thrown off the land moved to cities to become the workforce for industrial factories and so on. So this is what we call proletarianization. Basically, people lost access to the land. They lost access to an older means of survival, after which they basically become compelled to trade their labor for money. To use modern terminology, network effects kick in and markets become like a vortex that you're sucked into. So this process where this distant market vortex basically sucks things in is a logic that really starts to proliferate, and we basically become creatures of money. Now, as the chemistry of our society changes, certain forces get released, a bit like the spirits released in the myth of Pandora's box. For example, the growth of market capitalism often goes hand in hand with the growth of what we call commodification. Now, one way to see commodification is to see it as a process by which some whole thing is broken into parts that are then treated as individually tradable commodities. Let's imagine 18th century Baka hunters living within a primary rainforest in Central Africa. Now imagine that a bunch of foreign loggers that are connected to some distant market vortex enter the forest to hack down the trees, transforming them into separate logs that end up hundreds of kilometers away from that forest. Basically, a previous whole, a forest, is being ripped apart into pieces, and the pieces are ending up decontextualized, separated from their context. And it's also very deeply linked to the rise of colonialism. For example, the Baka people themselves became commodified through things like the Atlantic slave trade, which was connected to a distant market vortex, aka US plantations, that were producing goods for a global market. Now, this literally sucked people like the Baka from their forest homes and transformed them into tradable commodities, thousands of kilometers away from their original context. Look at this poster. It's from 1769, which is a year in which the Industrial Revolution was kicking off. Many of the commodities that would be produced by these commoditized slaves would end up actually becoming the raw material for what's called industrialization in Europe, which is also linked to the rise of fossil fuel energy, which powered these machines to massively scale up production. Now, this was allowing for much higher concentration of wealth and therefore inequality. This is actually why the rise of industrial capitalism is inseparable from the rise of racial inequalities, and also, actually nowadays, the climate crisis. Money as addiction. So as this combination of states and markets and monetary exchange spreads around, it basically changes the structure of our relationships and removes us from those old scenarios where those things weren't necessary. In a sense, they change the chemistry of our economic superorganism. So one metaphor that might help you to understand some of this is smoking. Now, a child experiences no intrinsic demand for cigarettes. As a teenager, though, they might dabble in social smoking. Cigarettes, though, will slowly change their body chemistry and eventually cause them to become addicted. Once that happens, they cease to choose to smoke and rather smoke out of compulsion or out of addiction. Now, in a very similar fashion, tribal societies like the Xhosa and Zulu people in southern Africa had no intrinsic demand for money. They were actually able to survive without it for hundreds of years through their traditional subsistence systems. But with the arrival of colonial settlers, they started to dabble on the edges of market economies, basically doing the monetary equivalent of social smoking. But they could still live outside of the colonial market economy. Now, this slowly changed as the colonial government started to force them to pay hut taxes, which basically required them to go work in the mines to get the colonial money needed to pay the tax. In fact, this is spelled out very, very clearly in the 1893 report by the Committee of the Mine Managers Association in South Africa, where they say, "It is suggested to raise the hut tax to such an amount that more natives will be induced to seek work, and especially by making this tax payable in coins only." Now, that word induced is very, very telling because it suggests a process of trying to artificially stimulate demand for something that isn't really intrinsically demanded. Now, this is the early stages of that proletarianization, the process by which people are severed from some previous means of survival and integrated into a new one. Basically, wage labor. Breaking economic progress narratives. So many modern economists have the sense that modern market capitalism is the apex or the high point of a long arc of history. It's seen to be some kind of advanced and sophisticated system that can be contrasted to these older, cruder systems and older ways of being. Now, in many ways, what these economists will often have is a kind of high score concept of progress, Now, this is a term borrowed from video games, where a player will start with a score of 0 and then accumulate a higher score as they move up levels, and as they basically build up an inventory of items that they will constantly upgrade. Now, a high score concept of history has a similar structure. It basically starts with a background image of humans as prehistoric beings with a score of 0, and then goes on to describe history as some long march in which we slowly go up levels, moving in a general trajectory towards ever higher technology, speed, accumulation, complexity, and scale. Now, under this conception, the frenetic rat race or hamster wheel of modern capitalism is seen as some kind of level up from some previous economic system. And it's seen as accelerating our score ever higher. Now, the imagined frontier of progress constantly shifts under capitalism. But in our current world, you'll see this progress narrative in, for example, digital hype, which carries this idea that anybody who's not using a particular set of technology products is going to be left behind by some grand arc of history that's getting higher and higher and higher and more advanced. Now, this goes hand in hand with the idea of international development. So-called developing nations are those who still have to catch up with the imagined current high score. In reality, though, this process of casting some people as undeveloped is actually pretty similar to that situation of ancient elites and ancient states casting tribal people as being uncivilized barbarians who need to be subjugated. So this kind of mentality is a thought pattern that continues to this day. For example, here's a photo of tribal Xhosa kids. A person who is stuck in a normal progress narrative will often see an absence of things in this photo. They notice that there are no markets, malls, and products. A person with anthropological goggles, however, will often see the presence of non-market economies and a different way of life here. Notice, for example, the hunting dogs and the subsistence agriculture on the hills. Now, you can choose to see this as undeveloped, but you can also choose to just see this as a different way of being, a different form of development. This community just has a different mix of principles and systems. So, to visualize the past, present, and future of economic life, we must actually discard these typical progress narratives. And anthropology often actually allows us to see that there are many different ways of being in the world, and that they are in fact all valid. Indigenous Australian people do not live a worse life than someone living under modern capitalism in London. They live a different life, with a different sense of time, and a different sense of what's important, about what's necessary and what's not. So we must never stack these ways of being into some kind of imagined ladder of advancement or chain of progress. Rather, we must basically see them in parallel. Unfortunately, people who grow up in a market society often struggle to do this because they cannot actually imagine any other way of being. So, in the next episode, we'll explore that experience and how it affects our minds. See you next time.